good time to call it a day.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It was very good. Enjoy it. That's the Aubrey.
Oh, I see.
He's also the boss of the bunch. This guy is
Oh, really? I didn't know she had a son.
Trump said somebody was tampering with his microphone. To what effect? They're tampering with his microphone. What did they? No, tampering with his microphone. He just said that. I know, but I mean, you could hear it. Everyone else. Yeah.
Well, I had part of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hello, welcome. The speakers. Also going to make their way downstairs.
Okay.
She published a book recently called something, The Lost Mountains.
Except anything he said.
Keep them all. It's $35. That's probably going to sell it.
Yeah, well, I just everybody.
No, books, lectures.
That was a seminar too.
No, I had a good time with them. They're very enjoyable, very, it's, you're right, actually, it's based on the movie, originally it was the movie first,
Oh, I see.
and then all the way to holiday songs together, you know.
Oh, drive. Did she get it
Easter
before?
Bonnet
Oh,
and
she did.
whatever, blue skies in between, cheek to cheek in between, and then holiday and white Christmas, and something called Thanksgiving of Country. But very well done, very, the dance is fantastic, choreography was very, very enjoyable, very well, lots of tap dancing, of course, it was good, very enjoyable. Still in previews, and I wonder what the review would say when they open. I think they did, I don't know, this month? I think they did this month. So it was good. And then after we went to Adia in 2 days, Bilteria.
Yeah.
Yes, we're going.
Adia, nice place on 51st Street, very close to 9th Avenue, 8 and 9, closer to 9th. A wine bar. So we had some tapas, some little appetizers, and shared
Here's a review in New York.
pasta, gnocchi
Yeah,
with
today.
black truffle, but it was the olive oil.
Yeah, fake stuff.
Yeah. But it was good. And so we had some rosé wines and chatted with the bartender who turned out to be Brazilian. So it was good. We had a good time. You always have a good time with Bill.
Yeah.
So it's got in Florida now.
Yeah.
Fridays,
Yeah, it seems that. It's a short trip.
Today.
Coming back from Wednesday.
What's tomorrow?
Oh, that's right. We went, no, we went to
Oh,
we went
yes,
Sunday and you went yesterday,
yes.
of course, you saw it yesterday. So you got this report.
Oh, I'm going. I'm going. Yeah, I'm going. I signed up for it.
So what do you think of the big?
Yes, I know Sarah.
Well, I'm just
Well,
rattled.
I was
Yeah.
mixed up with Jay.
Kept her.
Yeah.
Grimacing, good. Just, there was published a pictures when he makes a funny face.
Yeah, I love her.
She's got advanced figures together. She teaches memory.
Well, I mean, I think that you might love it.
One of the radio reports today.
Yeah.
Trump campaign is saying she viewed the questions.
It's not, it's really
Yeah.
very.
And he's saying that his microphone didn't work.
I think it's
You're
ideal.
fine when you want.
No, I
Of
understand.
course it would work fine. Of course it would work. And the other people say he was sniffling so much. I wonder whether it's just on drugs.
I probably had a cold, but at some point I felt like adding in the handkerchief. The sniffles were really awful. I listened a little bit afterwards to David Brooks and Mark Shields. Yeah. What they had to say.
I know, well, what did we go to? We went to the day
Stefan
club.
was on
I went with a friend of mine and we
a little
went out
bit.
at 11 a.m. or something. It was like.
CNN went off
a
2 hours.
They were giving, they were giving the day club away.
Come on, it takes so
So
much.
I, left. It's not.
So let's see what the next one brings. The next is the vice presidential.
I wonder if it's that way.
Tim McCain is not that great. Let's see.
That's on a Sunday, isn't it?
I don't know.
I think it's the 8th. 9th. I think it is on Sunday. It's not coming.
Yeah, cool.
Barbara caught her in town for a few days.
Oh, again? She was here recently.
She was here in May.
Well, I mean, I
Oh,
really.
that long ago?
Yeah.
Time flies. Where's she staying?
It was so too.
She's staying with Selma and then she's staying in Tree Desert.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
Well, she's catching a few performances. She's going to Tristan for Saturday matinee. And then come up to my apartment on Saturday evening. And I guess I'll have a drink with her. She arrives on Friday. So she wanted to take me out. I don't know whether I want to do 3 days in a row. The whole weekend.
You had it last week, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like her very much, but maybe it's too much of a good thing.
Yeah. What did she catch on? Just on what?
Dangerous liaisons.
Oh,
It's just going into previews.
The elbow was
We're starting previews, I think, on the 7th.
She's Helen Frank.
Also another show that didn't mean anything to me. So I don't know what else she was taking as well.
A show. Well, yeah.
She said it's a really good
That
idea.
was-
Yeah.
There was real conflict between her on the 3rd and the 4th. They were in the same line.
What was the name?
I should know, I
That's
just.
okay, you can't remember.
No, I
And
know.
on Sunday with the theater, I had to take my map all the way, get lost down on West Village.
Oh, there's food. They hold on
food
for.
play.
Yeah.
And it would have been very enjoyable, but it's so cold in the theater that I was sitting somewhere where it was right at me. I think it was a matter of fact, I had to leave after intermission. I was really angry, and today when primary stage sent me an email how I liked it kind of thing.
More spoken.
I
Three of them, I don't know what was together, only 3 people.
I had to check. So on the way out, I spoke to some of the people standing around from the theater, and I said, "Well, is there any air conditioning?" I said, "You know, it's only 68 or something outside." She said, "Well, you know, it's sort of uneven in that building. For the actors to be comfortable, they complain that they get too hot because of the stage lights. Meanwhile, I mean, Mr. Narlow, I mean, it was that cold. I just couldn't stay."
Was it so loud? You couldn't
Yeah,
hear
it was
us?
so loud. It's a tiny theater.
You couldn't take another seat on the. Oh.
So it probably wouldn't have made any difference in the orchestra, you know, I mean, the theater was really busy. The actors move around and they build up the sweat. Just the fish that sit there. Very, very uncomfortable.
Well, what you saw, did you like it?
Yes, of course I did. Hallie, I think is her name. Hallie Foot, his daughter, and she's a wonderful actress. Another one of those, family sagas.
Yeah.
About me, personal friends. Down in Texas.
Oh, what a shame.
And then waited forever for the bus. I really waited forever for the bus going down, but I had not enough time. I had stopped off at Town Water first because they raised me again too.
Oh,
So I told them,
did you get it out?
yeah, yeah. And then took the number 7 bus down, but I got off a little bit too early. I got off while my hairdresser was actually stayed home from that stop. But as I said, I took the map.
Yeah, it's very hidden, the cherry.
Yeah,
Lane.
grove.
That corner, the lower corner, the cul-de-sac almost, yeah.
Yeah,
On the other corner is the restaurant.
Grange, yeah.
Yeah. I always want to go. Did we go? No. No. But they changed
I went there
names
once,
a
many,
couple
many
of
years ago.
times. They changed ownership to the airport a number of times. So
Right.
I don't know.
It's nice down there though, you still have a lot of
Yeah, I like that
individual
area.
stores and dogs and we can stay on the steps to their buildings.
Yeah, I
It's
like that.
nice.
It's very,
Want to see the silver?
very Greenwich Village. What a shame.
Yeah. It's unfortunate.
Didn't they offer you another ticket? No.
What's the difference? I'm still gonna be freezing.
Yeah, they don't plan to. Well, you're probably not the only one commenting. on
Oh, there were a
the
few
cold.
people who, there were definitely a few people who left. I don't know how many people complained. Maybe it was different in some parts of the theater, but as I said, it's a very small theater. I must have sat right underneath one of those vents. I mean, the theater's cute. They did it some years ago.
Yeah, I know, I still go to, in fact, I'm going, you know, next week. Yeah, I'm kind of nomadic. And I spend the month in Argentina every year.
Two months in South Africa, 2 months in Paris.
It's about 5 months, I think, left.
I was going to send my record to my regular physician, Dr. Solomon, which he did.
Well, I
Dr.
I'm
Solomon.
not sure exactly where do you want us?
Well, I think I want you on either side of
Okay.
it, and I'm just gonna sort of sit in the middle
He
and ask
didn't have a
questions.
higher
Yep.
injections. I don't know. But I needed to do
Hello?
something.
The book mandate therapy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I came especially to see you.
Oh, wow.
I have missed you so many years.
It's a long time.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
After you left,
Like 6 shots.
but you came back to me in the mail.
3 on 3.
Nice.
And then I tried reaching you in other places, but.
So the next time I'll see you, Dr.
And
Solomon.
because you were going shows, I couldn't reach you.
Yeah.
We can discuss it with.
I'm here about 5 months a year. I travel the rest of the time. But I'm around.
Tomorrow.
Do you have a card or something?
I do.
Sure, Kat.
I'm going, I just,
So,
basically, not really here, just go back to these.
just have a kind of conversation for 4 minutes or so.
It's just exactly what I
Always say something we don't say many times.
So, Oh, I don't care, it's your call. Okay with it.
Thanks so much. You know that 10 years after the book was published, they were still writing big reviews about it.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to
It
hear
couldn't have been done without you.
that. Well, thank you.
So thank you again so much. It's good to see you.
Basically, I just want to know how much impact we had since 1750, and how would you measure that? Trials do a bunch of different measures.
Whatever you want.
Percent
It's awesome.
Quite, probably quite what I know and things like
Today, 4 o'clock. But I was there earlier as usual, and he took me over and he said, it doesn't seem to have that many patients.
Incredibly,
Because I was there like
indeed, it was kind of a preliminary stage of communism, because it was
40 years
going
so.
to make
They
possible
called me in
a
immediately,
post-scarcity
but then in
society.
the
And
office.
you know, at some level,
I had to
that's
wait.
the discussion we're having right now about are these robots, artificial intelligence going to
I have not one next
and
week, Tuesday.
that in turn has raised this whole debate
He says
about
3, 4, so I said, no, I was 3.
delinking.
He says, I should come a little earlier
And how are
because
we
it's
going
1 to 4.
to make it, especially since it also lived.
Then I went to the receptionist.
So it's a real.
Which is a good story.
Next week.
Well, in many ways, it's a very positive story. Although, insofar as
that in on
they're,
Wednesday.
insofar as their age is
She says, she's going to ask him,
backsliding on that, not on
call me,
a
leave a
continuing
message.
rise.
Well, for you, it doesn't matter whether
Doesn't
it's on
matter.
one day or the other.
Yeah.
Continues as it has for 160 years.
She had a Wednesday, he told me fly in on Wednesday.
Since
I think you know,
4 years ago, so it was,
I've seen
the
the
life
life
expectancy
expectancy
increases a year every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that was 3
So that could be the last one.
at the like peak, the longest life expectancy in the world, which then was Swedish women, now it's Japanese women. But the problem is, you know, people live forever.
It's a rare opportunity. First one.
96 was she a problem. So she just lived forever. So the real problem with the relationship between work and income is people just not going to be working much. So anyway, I got those sorts of discussions. And it's, you know, I mean, on the technology side of the project, it's quite.
Ältere Herrschaften, so wie wir,
Some
noch älter.
Zuckerberg's like,
Ich dachte, Studenten wären auch
medicine's only been scientific for about 100 years. And then, you know, what happened is basically life expectancies grew first because we eradicated diseases that killed people in their youth.
And that's
They
one of the.
lived out their life, and then now the changes are extending older life. But it's, there's every reason to think it's going to continue to that direction. So.
So ik stel me nog zo'n dag.
Technological expectancy, I mean, world population is also still expected to grow by 20 to 9 billion.
What's your
It's
plan?
another quarter
Yeah.
of its current level.
Yeah.
And of course, it was 2 billion at the end of World War II. So like, when I hear this business about 65 million, you know, it's the worst refugee crisis since World War II, it's sort of like, yes, the population has tripled since then.
So relatively.
So relative, you have to have 200 million to have the same.
Mine is worse, but it doesn't hurt.
But that's kind of like apocalyptic kind of language that people.
Well, I mean, that's basically recognized. I mean, it's one of these awkward things, like, it's not as bad as the 65 million refugee crisis since World War II. On the other hand, there's still 65 million refugees in the world, and that's not a good thing. So one doesn't want to be seen as just, I mean, I think it's Hillary's problem, actually, because Trump paints this picture of everything so terrible. And she's like, that's not true. Create a lot of jobs.
The young lady about there now
Since the Bush years, right? But, you know, if you see positive things, then you're not connected to people's pain, and that's what
Yeah.
that's what's driving the Trump. So, So it's an awkward position. Somebody once said intellectuals thrive on criticism, and therefore they need to sort of have criticism that stings, going around telling people that things are good. It doesn't sell a lot of newspapers, but that's also part of the Trump.
General Assembly still going on?
Appears that there's all this crime, because if you watch the news.
I think you're really in the green light.
Okay. I'm not going to use this microphone.
Okay. Well, I can put it here and you can probably catch it.
I don't know if I really need this microphone, but thank you all for coming. My name is John Torpy. I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And before I do anything else, I want to thank Patrizia Nobbe, who's the associate director of the European Union Studies Center, for her efforts in making this event possible. I want to welcome you to this evening's discussion about museums, memories, and politics with Tiffany Jenkins and David Rieff. But before I get into details about them and their books, I have an announcement to make about the Leo-Baeck Institute. They are themselves doing a somewhat related event tomorrow evening on the topic of restitution, justice, and memory that stars my friend Elazar Barkan from Columbia, Sarah Wildman, who's a journalist and author, and Joanne Intrator, who is a psychiatrist and author, and she'll be involved in that. I also want to say that we're going to have a little reception afterwards. If you'd like to join us for a glass of wine and some cheese and crackers and that sort of thing, we're going to go upstairs to the Ralph Bunche Institute on the 5th floor of this building once this discussion is over. So please feel free, and there will be copies of the book, the books, I should say, for sale. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce these two speakers, and what I'd like to do this evening basically is to introduce them and say just a little bit about the books that they've written. I'm sure they'll have more to say about them, but we had the good fortune to learn that Tiffany Jenkins was coming through town, and David Rieff had recently published a book on similar subjects, so we thought we'd have a conversation with them about the issues that their books raise, which are joined really by this question of the past and who the past belongs to and these kinds of things. So Tiffany Jenkins, I first met 10 years ago? No, 20 years ago.
Maybe, yeah.
20 years ago.
A little different.
I mean, she hasn't changed a bit. It's actually astounding. She looks every bit as good now as she did 20 years ago. And Tiffany is a sociologist and author who's also a radio journalist, and she's written a book called, and of course I love this title, I like good titles, but this one's called Keeping Their Marbles: How Museums Acquired Their Treasures of the Past and Why They Should Keep Them. And she writes a column, or has written a column, a weekly column on social and cultural issues for The Scotsman. I came to know her as a person who was involved in the programming of an organization called the Institute of Ideas in London, and participated in some of their activities. That was very, very interesting. She's also written a book about contesting human remains in museum collections. So you see the issues have to do with museums and their holdings and what happens with them. David Rieff, on my left, is a New York-based journalist and author, probably familiar to many of you already. During the 1990s, he covered conflicts in Africa, the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, and in Central Asia. He's written extensively about Iraq and more recently about Latin America. He's the author of 8 books, including Slaughterhouse, Bosnia and the Failure of the West, and A Bed for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis. And he's published widely in newspapers and magazines in the US and elsewhere. His latest book is this book, In Praise of Forgetting: The Irony of Historical Memory, which was published in April of this year by Yale University Press. So, I mean, just very briefly, Tiffany's book is, as you will guess from the title, is really sort of a history of museums and how they came to have the holdings that they have, and then about the debates that have taken off in recent years about what should happen with the holdings of those museums. What are museums for? Who does the past and who do these artifacts belong to? Has been a rather contentious issue. There's been a kind of rise in the number of claims for so-called repatriation, or sort of returning these artifacts to the putative communities from which they came. Of course, that's where part of the rub comes in, the question of sort of historical continuity between the place from which certain things may have originally have come and the current dispensation, if you like. And what is the relationship between those two things? Again, what is the purpose of museums? Whose interests do they serve? I think Tiffany feels very strongly that museums are a source of enlightenment and sort of knowledge about other parts of the world and about pasts that many of us would not have learned about had we not had the opportunity to encounter some of these things in museums. So her position is, I think, certainly a respectable one, but one about which there could be and probably will be some discussion and controversy. David Rieff's book, In Praise of Forgetting, Historical Memory and Its Ironies, is more directly engaged with recent debates about coming to terms with the past and the idea of sort of lessons from the past. The Holocaust has been, of course, most particularly a kind of source of thinking about how we should use the past in order to avoid historical injustices or injustices in general in the future. The idea that never again is going to kind of inoculate us against the kinds of things that people have done to each other in the past. I think it's fair to say that the book is essentially extensively skeptical of that idea, and whether or not those kinds of aims are going to flow from a kind of encounter with or reappropriation of historical memory. I think he sees this as somewhat bound up with identity politics kinds of questions, and often I think he thinks that, given the title of the book, In Praise of Forgetting, he thinks often things would be better off simply forgotten. The textbook case of this, I think, in general, has been Spain, and Spain after the Franco regime, but I have a sense that perhaps his view of these things is driven to a considerable degree by his experience of places like the Balkans and Kosovo, where the past has been not a source of reconciliation, but a sort of Pandora's box that has gotten the region into a lot of trouble. So, on the basis of that little bit of background about each of the books, I thought I would just simply ask a few questions, and we'd have a conversation up here for 45 minutes or so, and then we'd open it up to question and answer. So, I guess the first question I wanted to ask is, Walter Benjamin famously once wrote that there's no artifact or document, depending on the translation you have, there's no artifact of culture that is not at the same time an artifact of barbarism. In other words, while beautiful things may have been created, they were created under circumstances of cruelty, exploitation, domination, and the like. The question is, was Benjamin right? And does his remark help us make sense of the controversies over culture and history that we're engaged in today?
Yes, it's an interesting question. The way I see it, I look a lot at museums, and I think museums are quite a good prism for understanding broader debates in society about culture and history. And one of the interesting things about museums is that for some time, and indeed antiquity, has been used to very much glorify contemporary leaders, to affirm values to do with, say, in relationship to the Elgin marbles and the British elite and the Bavarian elite. they tried to use the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon marbles to show that they were connected to antiquity. So culture was seen as very positive, it was a very good thing, and I think now what's happened is that Benjamin's idea that it's associated with barbarism is mainstream. It's mainstream out with the museum community, but also to some extent within. And I'm really interested when you go around museums now, they often highlight the most negative aspects of them and of how either those artefacts were acquired or how they were used. So, for example, there's a museum in Glasgow called the Kelvin Grove, and the Renaissance galleries, which are beautiful, are full of reminders that this was a very violent time, and these paintings may have been drawn up for patrons who were vicious and authoritarian and horrible. And so the worst aspects of what may be associated with culture is now associated with things that used to be just seen as either objects of adornment or privilege or greatness. I think Walter Benjamin might even be surprised today that that maxim is mainstream.
Yeah, thank you for coming to this very lunar and peculiar basement. What happened? Sorry. The actual quote, at least in the canonical translation, is that there's no document of civilization, quite different from culture, which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The reason that I think that's a valuable thing to point out, it's not sheerly pedantry. Sorry, I just want to turn this off. Is that I do think Benjamin was talking much more broadly. And I mean, certainly if anyone revered classical culture, it was Benjamin himself. But when you speak of civilization, you're speaking of much broader claims. And those are supremacist claims, at least in Benjamin's time. They were European supremacist terms. Civilization. I mean, civilization, we're the civilized ones and everyone else is the barbarians. The barbarians at the time, of course, also happened to be colonized. I can't say I enjoyed these didactic and hortatory exhibitions, but I think they've served as if you like, a useful counter-irritant to the triumphalism of the past. Again, I don't think culture is the central locus of this. The least thing I'm concerned with is, I have no opinion about whether the Elgin marbles should be given back to the current, Syriza or not. It's not a view it's not something I have a view about. I do have a view about if you're being serious about the past, if your serious history is critical history. Now, maybe it's gone too far, and maybe its public expressions are at times less useful than the people making them think, like your museum people in Glasgow. But I certainly think, given the actual history, I'm not talking about mythical history, I'm not actually talking about what I write about, but the actual history, the history of colonization, the history. Look at Syria. Why does Syria look like Syria? It looks like Syria because this is 1919. A man called Sykes and a man called Picot drew the borders. That's what happened. There is a historic Syria much earlier, but there are these boundaries, and certainly all boundaries in Africa, to my knowledge, with the exception of Eritrea, were founded by what we call, pre-colonial powers. You could say Somalia is also an exception in the sense that if you believe that Somalia is now 3 states, not 1. But, I think there are 2 issues here. One is historical fact, and the other is what we do with it. And maybe I should stop with that.
You have to tell us the second one. You tell us the one first.
What was the second? I'm sorry. What was it gonna?
What do you do with the historical facts?
Oh, what do you do with the historical facts? Well, if you really take the historical facts into account, I would argue that at least where politics is concerned, the villains outweigh the non-villains. I mean, there was a great British jurist of the 19th century, Sir Henry Maine, and he wrote that it was war and not peace that's the constant in human history. Now, this is an institution. I mean, we're speaking at Tiffany and I at an institution that's devoted to the memory of Ralph Bunche, and the founding of the UN obviously was an effort to make Sir Henry Maine finally wrong after all these millennia. But I think if you look at, the history of the world, at least until 1945, it's clear that there was a big war somewhere in the world, at least every 25, 30 years for basically all of human history. Do we live in another time? Steven Pinker thinks we do. Ralph Bunche hoped we did. I don't think we do. I think this is an anomaly, this period of the so-called long peace. But then, the only person as pessimistic as I am that I know of is my friend John Gray. And so, that's the side I'm on, full disclosure.
He's very cheerful.
Very chill. He's actually a very chill person, as you probably know.
So, I mean, this raises
So
the
what?
question that you get into in the book, and that I think is relevant to your book, and it's this question, the relationship between history and memory. Right? I mean, that's in some ways one of the main targets of the book, is this way in which memory has come to serve certain political purposes, but is really something different from what people in the historical profession do. But I think there's been a tendency, even in the history profession, for these things to sort of be collapsed and not to be seen as, necessarily so distinct. But it gets into these questions of the continuity that I was mentioning in my introduction, the question of the continuity between those groups that are making claims and the original sources of these artifacts that are ending up in museums. So, it seems to me that, part of your book is to say that, the Elgin marbles are where they are because Mr. Lord Elgin got permission, basically, to move them. And then, then there's the issue that, they may have been better maintained, they would have survived because they wouldn't have had they remained where they are. So I wonder how you see this issue of sort of history and memory, which I think I tend to see, like you, I think is very different, but they've tended to be collapsed, I think, in recent years.
Let me think. The thing that interests me is why you've seen a turn towards the past and a particular heinous aspect of the past in really the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, David's right. Obviously, a lot of things that are being discussed in broader society about the history of colonisation. Cecil Rhodes in the UK is a very controversial figure now, and they want to remove some statues of him at Oxford College. It's not that this thing didn't happen, but it's that there's a kind of rise of interest in the past and a particular negative aspect of the past. And you see, it's not really history. I think that, but it's not as if that those people who are calling for example, the pulling down of the Cecil Rhodes statue are looking and interrogating history and fighting over the meaning of it and examining sources and interpretation, all of which would be a thoroughly good thing. And the nature of historical investigation is to debate the meaning of the past. And I don't think that's what you're seeing. I think instead the past is almost being, it's being almost used as a way of providing a victim identity for people today, for different groups, and rather than tackling some present day inequalities, those groups are battling over the past. So, for example, post-1980s, there's been a big surge of repatriation claims, not just for the Elgin marbles, but for human remains, the museum collections, sacred objects to Native American communities. This has happened in Europe as well as Australia and New Zealand. And those groups previously wouldn't have argued for the return of things, and now they are. They do it on the basis that they were taken in times of colonisation, and all true. But the return and the recognition of those wrongs, the righting of those wrongs, are seen as providing some sort of solution to contemporary ills. So history is being put to kind of an instrumental and therapeutic purpose, if that makes sense. And the problem I have with that is that it's not history, number one. And number two, I'm not sure that's the solution to those problems. So it's not history, I think, would be my concern.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. Of course it's not history. Real history is critical history, just as you said. And there's really no doubting that. But it isn't as if to be fair, and I'm very much of Tiffany's opinion on this. I don't agree about the remains, but I do agree. I was a kid in Stanford. I'm 64 years old. I was a child in Stanford. I remember going up that big tower and seeing those bones, those Native American bones in cases after cases, and I think they shouldn't have been there in the first place, and I'm very glad that they're giving them back. So, I would make a distinction. I don't, as I said in my opening, I don't have a view about the Elgin marbles. And, I don't think, I don't have views, and I'm sure your explanation of what maybe less the Greeks, but certainly some of the other claims that are being made are certainly, driven by political ideas. But, and it's a big caveat, I think if what had happened was that we moved from public celebrations, museum culture, statuary, national holidays, etc., from critical history to victims' history, then I would be completely of your opinion. But I don't think that's what we did. We moved from the triumphalist history of the state, that is looking from above, to the victim's perspective, which is what now is the most attractive to many, certainly to many young people within the historical profession. I entirely agree with you. Some of that isn't so bad. Do you really want, the kings and queens version of European history, or have all these historians, whether it's Lynn Hunt or Bob Darnton, France, the country I know best besides this one, where I've lived and where I teach, surely even in the historical profession, some of the refocusing from kings and battles and biographies of great men, as it used to be called, both the great and the men being dispositive in the instance, what we moved from was the distortions that the state imposed. And from the beginning of all the theorists of nationalism, the greatest of whom was Ernest Renan, and he in his work on the nation, that the nation has to skip a lot of the unpleasant historical stuff in order to build solidarity. That's what he says. And he says if you actually told the truth, of course, you'd never get any national solidarity implication, because it was largely one long bloodbath. Look at the origins of pretty much any state. Shoyinka was very good on this in his, in his book on Nigeria, the polemical book on Nigeria's name on blogging. One of the chapter titles is "A Bad Beginning, but No Worse Than Many Others," and I think we've just gone from one set of distortions to the other. I agree there are distortions, I completely agree. But that's what public history always was. It's just now it's distorted in other causes, I think. There's an argument against it, and one must, I don't like the glorification I didn't like the glorification of states. And I don't like the glorification of the victims. I don't like glorification, full stop. But I don't, I think it's important to be clear, where we've come from. It's not as if, the Benjamin quote interests me a lot because precisely It's double nature. It's that he believes in civilization, but he wants to complicate it for you. And he wants to say, look at these people and this society, and how do you square the circle, say, of imperialism and democracy? I mean, it's an old problem, but it's a real problem. And it's not a problem you can just say, oh, that's PC rubbish, and go on your merry way.
I mean, I think both of your comments in a way lead into this question that I had suggested I might ask, namely about the extent to which this is really, both of these phenomena that you're addressing are really about the politicization of culture in our time. And, I guess one question is, why is that happening?
Is it happening?
Is it happening? Is it different from, the way that's been done in the past? I mean, I think you think it's something that's relatively new, or at least it's a distinct version of, past politicizations of culture. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you see why that's happening now.
Well, I think two things primarily have happened. One is that I think within aspects of the academy and museum institutions, there is an ambivalence towards the gains of the past. So this isn't something that I think has happened because there have been people out on the outside saying we demand our victims' history. It's come very much from within, which interests me. But I think so you've had a kind of, I could call it a kind of crisis of foundational values. So institutions like the British Museum, formed in the 18th century, glorifying the wonders of the Enlightenment, are uncomfortable now with that. They don't call themselves the British Museum quite so much. It's more a museum of world culture. You can see why they would do that. So there's that kind of uncertainty, and at the same time, I think the rise of the politicization of culture from the sort of 60s and 1970s onwards. So, and I think the failure of left-wing movements to transform society. So the end of the Cold War, culture becomes much more important, and it is noticeable in many of these debates when they happen in broader society. It is about changing the presentation of things. It's about taking statues down. Britain, it's about the putting more women on banknotes, and there's much more about culture, what we eat, whether we should be eating this stuff, whether we can wear certain earrings, Native American hairdresses, can we do that sort of thing, rather than material inequality, for example. Which I think is probably negative if you want to try and tackle those subjects. But it also turns culture into this political tool when it probably shouldn't be.
Well, I'm old enough to have gone to French schools before political correctness. And I will tell you that we, in my dixième class, second grade, third grade, remember, used to have read French history that was complete glorification. I remember I had a Laotian friend in this school called Surafong Ratsapong. God knows what happened to him. I'm sure he sided with the wrong people during the war and probably is long dead. But anyway, Surafong and I used to repeat the first phrase of the second grade textbook, which was, nos ancêtres, les Gaulois, furent blancs et courageux. Our ancestors, the Gauls, were blonde and courageous. So I don't buy it that it all starts with, Rudy Dutschke on the streets of Berlin, and Mark Rudd, or I don't know, pick your 1968, leader. I think what's happened, I think this always was true. If you read, Frances Fitzgerald 100 years ago wrote a book on American education, where she goes in great length about how the textbooks changed to reflect the current consensus. And of course, they have nothing to do with history, but the thing is, they never did. My late mother used to say, it was very moving to see the president inaugurate the museum on the Mall yesterday, the day before. But my late mother used to say she wouldn't set foot in the Holocaust Museum until there was a museum to the Middle Passage. And where was that when people like me were growing up? I think it's important to keep this thing, not to blow this thing completely out of proportion and not to start, describing, the temple as being torn down, because the temple wasn't so hot to begin with, in my view. And now, where you and I agree completely, where I think the point you make is not only important and right, but not nearly made enough, which is indeed that the PC stuff and the victim stuff comes out of the failure of the classical left. It seems to me there's no question about that. That simply the left picked up its marbles and went where it could find shelter, which tended to be in the universities and the museums and the like. And that, Hillary Clinton's a great example of this. Hillary Clinton is probably all for most of this identity politics stuff, but she's also the great friend of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And that's kind of the new, America is a libertarian country on a certain level. Students should have the right to make their own curricula. I mean, if you think of universities as businesses, why not? I mean, there's nothing inappropriate about that, surely, in a business. The customer's always right. So I agree. I mean, I think that's exactly where it went. But again, I think it's important to understand that these, when all those bones were sitting in, dusty cases in that Campanile in Palo Alto, I mean, California textbooks didn't have anything about any of that stuff. And so my argument is a different argument. It's that, not that memory, in praise of forgetting is not saying it's always right to forget. It's saying that the moralization of memory should be taken with a grain of salt, and that we should start, there are places where it's better to remember, where more remembrance is probably helpful, and places where it's not helpful. I think it was extremely unhelpful. Indeed, I think it was murderous in the Balkans. I spend 2 months in South Africa every year. I think quite a lot more memory would be helpful there. And that when the whites say it's time to forget, what they're really saying is apartheid wasn't so bad. And anyway, why can't we all get along with us having all the social capital and most of the capital? So I mean Archbishop Tutu said the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a gift Black South Africans gave to white South Africans, and white South Africans refused it. And I think that about sums it up, frankly.
Okay, well, since you've raised the Museum of African American History on the Mall, that was also something I thought I would ask about. It's of course been widely greeted as a way of improving our understanding of the role of slavery and of African Americans in the story of the United States. But even President Obama, in his remarks, said that it would not by itself alleviate poverty, eliminate gun violence, or ensure that justice is immediately going to be colorblind. So I wonder what you think it will do.
I was there on Saturday and I did look around the museum. The first surprise was that George Bush gave the best speech. He said it would do three things. It would be truth orientated, it would interrogate our past, and we've come face to face in particular with slavery. It would show that change is possible, and that it was about talent. And then he talked about Chuck Berry, and you remembered he was George Bush. I think what they have done with this museum, which has been a long time in coming, is raise expectations about what museums can achieve. But there were I think, about 33,000 people over the weekend with their families. I saw grandfather with a little boy, and it was very moving. It's eclectic, it's confused, it's exhilarating, and it's disappointing. I think it's interesting you mentioned the Holocaust Museum. In a way, I think probably there's similar narratives in both. In fact, there are. And that's where I think my concerns might be raised. So when the museum was proposed at Congress there was concerns that it would just be another identity museum. So the mall would be full of, Latino museum, women's rights museum, and all the rest of it. And Lonnie Bunch, the director, is very convincingly said this is a story of America. And I think he's right. But where the language of suffering and the therapeutic discourse that you see throughout the museum, I think is concerning. So history is almost to be therapy, and I think it kind of promotes a victim identity. Now, one museum can't do everything, doesn't have that greater impact, but I think in a broader culture that promotes identity and victimhood, then there is a deleterious impact, because I don't think it rewards the losers, ultimately. I don't think it challenges the leaders and those in power. I think it reinforces a kind of supplicant, politics of recognition, really, which these institutions are involved in, involves a kind of supplicant. We need to have our pain and suffering recognised, and I think that kind of reinforces inequality.
I've never heard that argument before, I have to say. I don't agree with it, but I don't think I want to engage with it either very much, except to say that, the idea that you can have museums of American history without the history of African Americans being front and center, whether the museum is well done or not, I defer to you. I haven't seen it yet. So you may well be right that it's too eclectic, or it doesn't know what it wants to do, or whatever. But I think it's been long. That's one quote of my mother's that I offered a few minutes ago. My view is that it's a disgrace that we have had for many, many years all these monuments and museums to the Holocaust and to the Irish famine, when we didn't neither of which the United States was responsible for, and didn't have an African American museum. That seems to me an absurdity, and yet it was true for many, many years. And I believe that, you take care of your own first, if I can put it so bluntly and nationalistically. But I also agree that the idea that this is going to have some I do agree entirely with you, and I think I think it's unassailable what you said, that the idea that this will have some great transformative effect is just pure, Sunday school cant. And that there is an expectation that will not be met. I quite agree also. That's the thrust of, I understand correctly, of your argument, that this is a very poor replacement for economic analysis, for thinking seriously about the poor. But again, have we ever thought seriously about the poor? There's also that. Again, I don't want to, because I don't, I do like I like the fact that the African American Museum exists. And I wouldn't be so sorry to see Chicano one, incidentally. I don't see why that would be so, sort of, exotic. Certainly for those of us who, my mother came from Tucson, Arizona, basically. It's where she was born here, but she grew up there in the 1930s, and, on a certain level. D.H. Lawrence said that Monterrey, Mexico is more American than San Antonio, Texas. He said that in the 1930s or 20s. And, I don't think that would be so bad. But I'm a Latin America guy, so maybe I'm this special, please.
Well, one argument comes to mind that I heard from a friend in graduate school who taught, I'm not sure exactly what she would say, women's history, I guess. But her concern was that she didn't want it to be a separate thing that was off to the side. She wanted to say, this is American history, or whatever, this is history in general. And so the creation of a museum that's dedicated to a specific group may end up in that kind of position if you don't, at the same time rewrite, the history textbooks and that sort of thing of the country as a whole. And I guess you think that's probably a danger.
Say it again.
Well, that there's going to be this tendency to marginalize because it's an identity group.
I did think
You know.
that.
I mean, I'd be curious, for example, who was in the museum when you were there.
Oh, it was 80% black. But, I did think that. I don't think that anymore. I think it works because it's very much, and I do think the black experience is different in America. I think you do see the history of America in that museum. I think the thing that I think is worth asking about is what that history is and how it's approached. And I think what you have is the language of therapy. So it's about how people feel about this history and how the museum makes them feel about that history. Now, this isn't just museum labels, like there's a space there's counsellors on hand, and it's not that, for me, people don't get upset about history. This is some very powerful stuff in the museum. It's that, and it's that it's not a one-off. It's how I think at a certain level society is approaching history, which is as something to either feel pain about or to feel happy about. So there's also a narrative, a celebratory narrative in the last. I'm sorry, I'm saying narrative. And I'm trying to say that less often. The celebratory kind of story, which is this is a great ending. I mean, it's all about how we feel about it. Now, I think we will feel things regardless of how these things are constructed. But when that becomes how we judge something and how we judge history, I just think it's probably it's not. It comes back to this point, which is that it's not history. But you do have. You have calls at universities for changing the curriculum on the basis of what students feel about it. So I don't think it's just an isolated problem. And I think it does encourage people to view things through their emotions rather than their rationality in terms of how they understand the past. And actually the past is quite upsetting, so you can't avoid that.
Well, no, I mean, I agree, but first of all, the reason students have the kind of power they have in universities today is because the function of the university has changed. Universities are, for the most part, technical schools. I mean, I remind you that, for all the stuff you read in the National Review or the American Spectator, if it still exists, or First Things, or you name the right-wing paper about, the indoctrination of students in American universities to the left. 50% of the Harvard class of last year went either to Wall Street or to the white shoe law firms. So if that's indoctrination, then I'd like to see what non-indoctrination leads to. First point. Second point is that they're my father wrote a whole book about this. I mean, the therapeutic culture has triumphed, and it has triumphed largely in the West. In the rich world, even making little inroads into Japan. Interestingly, I was there recently, and I was surprised by that, because we all have that Ruth Benedict shame cultures and Greek and guilt culture stuff somewhere buried in the back of our minds. The therapeutic culture is everywhere. Everything is about feeling, except when it's about money, and that's the world we live in. It's a kind of world of a kind of weird, it's politically correct crony capitalism. An interesting time to be living, I suppose. I'm not sure what you do about it. Frankly, I think the universities and the things you're talking about, which I think are undeniable, though I'm extremely sympathetic, I should say quickly for the record, to renaming a whole lot of stuff. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. Indeed, I've publicly supported the students at Rhodes in South Africa. I was, as you were saying before we came out here, that Rhodes statue in Oxford, is so small that whether it represents, I didn't know this, but, knowing that, whether it's that worth worrying about. But, I think to have in Grahamstown, South Africa, a museum named after one of the people who colonized South Africa is a very bad thing. And that it should be renamed, and the quicker the better. And I think everybody, I think you, even those of you who think you're against this, actually aren't as much against it as you think you are. I mean, you know, there used to be this place called Stalingrad. Now, I think most people in this room, I'm willing that there's some ancient member of the Progressive Labor Party somewhere in the distance, but assuming that that person thought he or she had something better to do, I assume you'd all think renaming Stalingrad Volgograd was kind of a good idea. I think you would say that, you know, to have Generalissimo Franco, the Avenida Franco, bisecting Madrid, was probably a bad idea too. So the question becomes not whether we should rename things. Of course we should rename things. The question is where the limits are and whether it's gotten out of hand, if you will.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, Cecil Rose, as David said, I grew up in Oxford and I never saw this statue. It's a tiny little statue in the same colour as the rest of the building. So obviously if he comes down, I mean, nobody, I wouldn't shed any tears, but I'm interested in why now, a long time after, and what does this mean when students are asking for certain statues to be taken down? To what extent is it progressive? Is it challenging the status quo in a positive way? I don't think so. I think there's a sort of symbolism about it which is thin, but also the language in which people talk about the need for this isn't that we need to better understand the impact of this colonialist. I mean, a lot of people who were campaigning for us taking him down didn't really know very much about who he was.
Sure, that's true.
I'm sure that's the case about every political movement, but it's peculiar. And it was very much in the language of therapy. So this statue makes us feel oppressed. This statue makes us feel sad. And I think you have to confront. You not only have to confront the terrible things that happened in the past, but you have to try and understand them. And I think there's a certain degree of self-flattery about this. We can make ourselves feel better because we know he was a bad guy, and we're not like that. And so this kind of self-serving aspect of that just makes me feel there's something quite not right about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I think particularly important is the point Tiffany makes about feeling better about yourself, because that, I think, is unquestionably true, and it conforms to Milan Kundera's famous definition of kitsch, which was that the problem with kitsch is that kitsch, you have predictable emotion and like yourself better for having it. And that was his whole definition of kitsch. And in the UK, in Oxford, from my small experience of that world, I think, that world since these debates started, I agree. But first of all, I would say, I would remind you that I don't think we would say that about statues of people whom, we agree are monsters. There's a consensus about there being monsters. You wouldn't, if you found an obscure statue of what would be some Liverpool slave trader of the 90s, or Lord Jeffrey Amherst, very good idea. You would not think we had to, what we needed to understand Lord Jeffrey Amherst, so I remind you all, sold smallpox-laden blankets to the Native American tribes of Western Massachusetts. My home state. I don't think you worry about that. I think the issue, again, is proportion. Saying that doesn't mean I admire the people doing it. I think that criticism you make is, I think it's largely kitsch. And it's largely beside the point of, what's really wrong in Britain. But I have no great objection to it. And I think in some cases, Amherst College, I went to Amherst College for a year. And he was a really terrible man, indefensible man. And, so I think there's some force the founders of Brown University, slavery. I don't think this stuff is quite as, obscure and rarefied as people. Sometimes people who are appalled by the change make it out to be. And then again in South Africa, that a major university in post-apartheid South Africa would be named after Cecil Rhodes strikes me as upsetting.
Just as a sort of side comment on this, I mean, it strikes me that a lot of this activity is basically taking place at elite universities and colleges and not elsewhere. And that it has to do in part with the transformation of universities into technical schools, but part of what's happening is higher education has been democratized. I mean, from 1960, for example, it's just much more open to people who hadn't had access to higher education. Certainly not elite higher education before. And I think at Amherst, which I attended myself, a lot of this has had to do with a feeling that people, feel out, they've been let in, but they're not really of the place. That there's something about the place that, okay, it's true, it makes them feel excluded in some way. But that at some level, I mean, I think there were certain excesses in the Amherst and other cases with regard to who got to say what and things like that. But at some level, it was really about trying to feel like, this is a place where I belong.
Perhaps. I don't know enough about that case, but I know about cases in Britain, and what you see is the students who are making the complaints about the curriculum or about the statues are white privileged students. I don't think that should mean you disregard, I don't care who it is, but the point is, it's not coming from the excluded groups, it's people speaking on behalf of. So it's quite, the check your privilege thing often comes from people who are quite privileged, speaking on behalf of those groups.
Okay, one question that we haven't really gotten into, but Tiffany in particular addresses at some length in the book, is the question of who owns culture, and you might say who owns memory. I think in both of these cases, there's been a kind of an assertion of a certain kind of privileged access to these things by certain groups that has had, I think it's like multiculturalism. It was originally intended to, give greater respect to groups that had been disrespected in the past, but has in some cases, I think, gone in a direction where these things become possessions that these are my things and you can't have them, and that lead to a kind of, solipsistic situation where nobody can really talk to each other. So I'm just sort of curious what you would say about that.
It put into mind, I don't know if people saw the response to Lionel Shriver's speech at Brisbane Literary Festival. Strangely enough, they invited her to speak about belonging and community, which is a peculiar thing. If anybody knows it, she's a very dry American author who wrote We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is a fictional account of Columbine massacre. She's not, anyway, that's by the by. She did a talk about cultural appropriation and how, as an author, the nature of what you do is appropriate under people's experiences. You don't necessarily write about your life as an American author who writes about Columbine massacres. You write about Armenians, or you write about 50-year-old men and all the rest of it. And she was trying to tackle this idea that you see in pop culture and contemporary culture that that if you write about somebody else's experience, you're appropriating it, and often you're doing it from a position of privilege. And I think we've got to the stage now where so much of what art and culture has been problematized. And so much of kind of just everyday living, which is that you see something, you like it, and you try it on. And she used the example of sombreros, which has been kind of criticised as being cultural appropriation, a silly example. But the point she made is that culture and being a writer is that you're empathising with other people. And I think that's the stage we've got to now from the 80s, when you had sort of debates about ownership of culture, who owns these objects. Greeks own Elgin marbles, African Nigerians own the Benin bronzes. Then then you have sort of that kind of move from ownership of objects to history. So in certain cases, the rewriting of history on the basis of your identity, and now it's, you know, Indian earrings. They seem quite trivial, but I think they're quite serious conflicts.
Okay. All right, well, it's 7 o'clock, and I promised that I'd open the discussion to the floor. So if anybody has a question, please feel free.
How would you recommend that history be taught? Should it be taught from the viewpoint of the country in which you are studying? Should it attempt to provide a variety of viewpoints without comment? Should it be taught by people who are partisans and defend themselves eloquently? Where's the right mix?
Well, first of all, at some level, it has to be, you have to, if you want to, to the extent that elementary and secondary school education is about forming citizens, which I think most people would agree it is, then in, elementary and secondary schools that do their jobs properly, you're certainly going to have to teach, have an emphasis on the country where you are. Having said that, there obviously should be courses on the rest of the world. It seems perfectly obvious when one puts it this way, but I don't really think there's any alternative. Also, the world is changing very fast, and when in 1900, 25% of the population of the world was European. It's some tiny fraction of that now, and will be even smaller soon. And world trade, if you want. In 1500, according to most economic historians, China and India control 50% of world trade. Then, in the great era of colonization and of India and the sort of decline of China, those figures went way down. Now they're going back up again, and it seems reasonable to expect that, in some, 100 years, it'll, that's the artificial date, in 2100, it'll be closer to what it was in 1500. And, you're gonna, you also teach, Willie Sutton said he robbed banks because that's where the money is. And, to some extent, you emphasize the civilizations that are powerful in their day. And I fully expect that'll happen. Anyway, as far as partisanship goes, obviously, if you're trying to teach students, you should try to be as nonpartisan as possible in, certainly in secondary schools. But, that's a goal. Everyone's partisan. It's just a question of how you handle your partisanship, isn't it? You have your opinions. American officers in the 1920s and 30s didn't vote because they thought there was a culture in the army of not voting. And some officers voted, but there was it was thought, this is not our affair, this politics. But, short of trying to find a cast of characters to teach who will have that degree of self-control, I think the most you can ask for is that, a lot of views will be represented. And here it is difficult because it's perfectly true. To take up, I don't know if Tiffany makes this point in her book, but it follows really from her argument that now certain views are supposed to be off limits. And the number of views that are off limits seems to be, to me, anecdotally, to be larger than it was. And that I do, I think I agree with you, and I think it's a problem.
From a British perspective or a Scottish perspective?
Well, for a while there was an attempt David mentioned citizenship, but for a while there was an attempt with history to give a sense of identity. And when it's so explicitly done, it'll happen anyway, but when it's so explicitly done, you end up compromising the discipline and the education. They also taught a historical methods course, which sounds really boring, but in that you had War and Peace by Tolstoy, who got the young people's attention, because really that book is about the theory of change. Does one individual make a difference, and all the rest of it? So you can introduce all sorts of questions which are really about history. What is it? And then you invite lots of people in who take a different point of view, and you have big rows. And I think that's probably the best way to introduce students to the idea that history isn't about facts, it's often about interpretation.
Original sources.
Original sources,
Original object.
yeah, the real thing.
Well, the other thing I would say is simply that history is by definition a revisionist undertaking. And most people think, there's one story and they've read that, and why is somebody writing another book about the French Revolution? Because we know what happened
Well,
then.
that's why museums are revisionist too. They, last summer I went to Israel for the first time. I went to, used to be called the Diaspora Museum, Bet HaFutzot, it's called, of the history of the Jewish people. And evidently in the, 70s, it was a state-of-the-art exhibit. I went, it was so boring, but they're redoing it. They're totally redoing it. You were talking about museums. Should it be the group, ethnic group, or the nation? I mean, you've heard about the new museum in Warsaw, the history of the Polish Jews, which looks at Jews in the whole context of Polish history, not focusing on the Holocaust, but the 1,000-year history. Now, it's brand new, it's state-of-the-art, that's the permanent exhibit, but they also have temporary exhibits. So that make people think differently about things. And so, so museums change too.
Yeah. There was one other thing actually, for a while in Britain, and it's still present, is that it was very much focused solely on the Holocaust history in secondary schools. But that meant in a way that students didn't quite get understanding what the Holocaust was. They didn't appreciate how exceptional it was, or what was and I think one of the reasons why they taught that was because we knew it was wrong. And so there's sort of a kind of, there was an attempt to moralize, which meant actually didn't really get an understanding of the Holocaust, strangely.
I mean, the Holocaust is a really good case in point, of course. I mean, until 1960 or later, there was the history of World War II, and then kind of there was these other things, but they really did play a very significant role in people's understanding of World War II, and then that completely, flipped around, and World War II disappeared.
Thanks. So if history should not be the source of sort of the normative story of each state, what should be the story of that? Because, willing or not, I'm also not the biggest fan of nation states, but we are in a state of play where we're going back to where we were, like a Britain. So what should then be the source of these normatives for personal history?
I'm more comfortable with the idea of the nation state being taught as an ideal and the history of it through history. I'm comfortable with that now because I think we're so, as a society, so detached from it and so kind of critical of it. And I'm concerned about the kind of fragmentation and the kind of particularism that you're seeing with identity politics. And I think effectively what you've got is both institutions unable to give people meaning, kind of flesh out what the sort of society stands for. And also I think the kind of shift in the political landscape has contributed to that as well. So without romanticising the past, in Britain you had a very strong labour movement that had many limitations to it, but was effectively interested in representing the interests of the working class to a degree and achieving social change. And I think that's gone. I mean, people are saying that we might see a resurgence of it, but like here, the political climate is very hit and miss. So I think some of the old ways of doing identity aren't as bad now as we think they are.
Well, I take it as a given that national histories will be taught, because question is, what will the history of, what will the content of that curriculum be? And that shifts, and it is important to keep this stuff, again, in proportion. I mean, look at, if you want, it's true that there's all this noisy PC stuff, but there's also the Texas Board of Education, which effectively has a lock on what, high school history books teach. And that is not a politically correct organization, to put it mildly. And, fragmentation is the word, but fragmentation in both directions. Whether it's possible to have consensus views in our time, I think, is an open question. I mean, look, the internet permits you to understand that you have more in common with somebody 8,000 kilometers away than with your neighbor, and to some extent alienates you from your neighbor unless your neighbor happens to share your views. And that, so how do we make communities in this world of virtual experiences, for example? My only comment on the marbles question is most people are going to see these things online. I mean, it's simply not realistic in a world of 7+ billion and soon to be 9 billion that people are going to be able to go to the British Museum or the Met, or for that matter, the Cairo Museum, or the big museum in Dakar. It's not going to happen. So, you started with Benjamin. Benjamin wrote this very famous, great essay called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And, he sees all these trends coming, although obviously he's talking about earlier kinds of technology and globalism. But I mean, that's the position we're in. So, somewhere between thinking we can just stay as we were and, giving it all up, is presumably something. What it is above my pay grade.
Responding to what you just said, I mean, the internet has revolutionized art history, and when Art Store started and images from museums started appearing online, and Art Store was a subscription for schools and universities, museums, it was discovered that when students see works online that are important or interesting, they want to go and see the original. Like, people in New York want to go to the Met, students, when they see things online. So the internet has really changed education, but it's also made people, in instances, want to seek out the authentic, I think. And I wanted to ask you, I remember, because I was in graduate school, I guess, I remember when Melina Mercuro was really, the really first person who really came out strongly to want the marbles to be returned. And last summer I was in London, and I was walking by the museum, and it's free, so I just said, I'm just going to run in and see them, and that's all I saw. I went in to see the Greek sculptures and then ran out. But what has happened since in terms of how that's played out?
The Greeks still want them back, but they've changed now they have the museum there, which gives them more justification that they can take care of them, but I haven't really paid attention to what's gone on since then. You've got a change in the content of the claims. So her argument is very much these are Greek, they're essential to our identity. As a nation, they are ours. So kind of in the kind of language of nationalism to a degree. And now it's more they were taken in dubious circumstances that is harmful to us. So the kind of content of claims has changed, and it's much more that if they come back, it'll be righting a wrong historical address. So it's the language of reparations that you can see in other claims as well. And I just think that's an interesting change, because it shows you what ideas have authority. What do I need to say to get a hearing? And today it's, we were wronged in the past and you can make it right and provide some sort of therapy for this kind of historical ill.
You know, can I answer the earlier point you made? Of course you're right that kids, if they like a work of art, like to see the original, that there's a patina or whatever you want to call it in a work of art. But the reality is that most of the works of art of the past are in the museums of the global north. That's a fact. And that fact means that most of the young people in the world will never see this art. And that's why I think this is a bigger problem than, you know, perhaps Tiffany does. I mean, because particularly since these museums make the claim to represent world culture. So, I mean, if you have the Benin bronzes and nobody in present-day West Africa, except a few rich people, are ever going to have the chance to see them, well, I think that's a problem. I don't know quite what the solution is, whether it's giving them back or, you know, thinking about them in a different way and making their identity largely virtual. But, I mean, I know that if what we're talking about is young people, well, I mean, you know, as I say, most young people today live in the poor world, and they're never going to make it, you know, to Bloomsbury.
Thank you. Well, I know you mentioned like elementary school, secondary school, teaching history and thinking about the children's developmental, like where are they, what point, you know, how much can they take, and creating citizens, yet we're telling history in a way that's kind of like, not lying, but covering much of the truth because they can't take it. Then when you go to college or higher education, you are told to throw everything in the garbage and then here, take this information, and this is the truth, and this is what you need to know, and now this is how you make your view on forward. How, like, what's the feeling of what kind of citizens are we creating, whether these young people have access to these museums or these actual historical statues or whatever, where they could go across, you know, the world to see the real thing or see it online, like, when they're, you know, you're kind of being lied to, and then you're like, here, this is actually the truth, this is where you live, this is where we came from, now what?
Well, I mean, realistically, I mean, my view is simply that American elementary and secondary opinion is terrible. Education is terrible, and American colleges are pretty good. So there's a sort of problem with that. It might be better if it were reversed, frankly. I mean, in terms of citizens and in terms of... Are they? Okay. You think they're good? You think American secondary education is getting better?
I don't know. I mean, universities are getting worse.
Oh, so that's the worst of all worlds. That really doesn't help me. Or the woman who just asked this question. I mean, there is this shock. I mean, there's no question that what you described is right. Is what people experience. You know, what the right mix is between, you know, how much truth people can take. Well, you know, we've been arguing about that for about 5,000 years, and I don't think I have a better answer than anyone else does.
Go ahead.
Sorry, but I have some doubts because I perceive, I don't know if it's true, that there's a misunderstanding in this educational perspective, maybe. Because I'm perceiving that youngsters or people going to museum, I mean, there are always considered as empty pots in which the state, the school, the teacher, somebody has to put something to create the citizen, the whatever. So in these terms, I'm wondering if we can a bit change probably the vision of what culture is and of what memory also is in terms of something that you can create I mean, culture is often seen as a backpack you carry, no? I'm from Italy, so I'm supposed to like pasta, probably. I'm supposed to
Drink wine.
Drink wine, yes, and I prefer beer, and I prefer couscous, and so probably I can, as a person, and as a person from 5 years old or whatever, modify what is culture or memory and I work with memories.
But you can't change history. I mean, you can't, you can talk about the present in any way you like, and you can criticize the education system for not giving students or young people room to express themselves as they wish rather than as people want them to, older people want them to. What you can't do is say, you can have your own Shoah. If I can use an extreme example. You can't just say, you, student X, doesn't really matter what happened in Auschwitz. What matters is how you feel about it and want to reinvent it. That really won't do. And on the other hand, it won't do if you want to have competent doctors and physicists and all those things. That too. I mean, you really wouldn't want to go to a cancer specialist who had created his or her own what would you call it, courses, and in effect rejected anything that, didn't suit. So it seems to me, I mean, the issue here is talking about history. If you're talking about the present, sure, there's a very strong argument that can be made that national presence, the present of any nation state, whether it's this one, Italy or regions, we shouldn't assume too much. We shouldn't assume you like pasta and wine. But on the other hand, we do sort of have to assume that, the slave trade really happened. And if we want to look at it seriously, our own wishes about it don't matter. They don't. I mean, your wishes can matter about what you want to emphasize, but you can't change the past. That's the point about history. There's a great English novel, if you talk about this sort of victim's history stuff, it's all about the present. It's what parts of the past are useful to the present. And how does the present how does the present choose to use the past? It doesn't have to be PC stuff. I mean, I spent 15 years as a kind of war correspondent, and I'll get to it, trust me. It goes in a big circle, but it gets there. The novel is The Go-Between by the English writer L.P. Hartley, and the first line of The Go-Between is, the past is another country, they do things differently there. And, that's what history actually is. Now, is it always a selection? Is it always in some level political? Sure. But, it is this, I think real history is critical history, but I don't think critical history in the sense that I mean it, which doesn't just, as has happened recently, and here I think Tiffany and I would probably agree, changing, one set of glorified people and objects for another set of glorified people and objects. I don't actually see that as a particular improvement, but I think that's really a question about our politics, our ethics, our values. And, having a big argument about that seems fine.
I emphasise that point. A lot of the debates about history today are about the present. I think that's always been the case, but especially so. And they're kind of used to solve present-day issues, but will not succeed in doing so. There's something to be asked about the way we think about the influence of the past on the present. You can see this in the slavery discussion. So to what extent does the kind of negative past impact upon the present? I would venture that we see it in quite a deterministic fashion, which isn't to say it's influential, which isn't to say it isn't influential, it is. But I think we our eyes are fixated on the past too much in political debates, certainly.
But that's because we think that, more to remember will inoculate ourselves. I mean, my book is an argument against that. I mean, the famous iteration of that thought. It's not a new thought. It's a thought that goes back to the Bible. But it, at least, it probably has Chinese equivalents, I would imagine, from what I know. But, the famous expression, modern iteration of it is the Spanish American philosopher George Santayana, who said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so forgetting becomes an immoral act in that context. And my view, for what it's worth, is sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that also we learn very little from the past, in my opinion. There's a wonderful man called Sir Nicholas Winton, saved a lot of Jews in the 1930s, lived to be 104 or something. He had all his marbles still, he's about 102. And he was an extraordinary fellow. And the Hard Talk guy, Stephen Sacker, BBC Hard Talk guy, Stephen Sacker, did an interview with him. And mostly about his unbelievably distinguished past and heroism and the rest. But at a certain point, Sacker asked sort of, isn't it terrible how everyone forgets about, the past, and what does that mean for the future? And Winton smiled and he said, to Sacker's amazement and actually befuddlement, he said, I don't think we learn anything from the past.
I missed that.
I don't think we learn anything from the past. Was Winton's phrase.
Wasn't that what
Can we?
Michael Lara said when he was here?
There are no lessons from the Holocaust.
I just have a question. It's about something that I don't know if people in the room know about it, because I just learned about it myself. But it had to do with at Harvard, where they abolished the name Housemaster and replaced it with something else. And speaking of the subject of renaming, do you think that was a meaningful name change, or just like giving into political correctness, or something in between?
Well, I don't know this story. I didn't go to Harvard, so I don't get the alumni magazine. And I don't follow it, and I'm too often abroad to necessarily get that deep in the weeds. But I will tell you that, I remember vividly when feminists demanded, I think entirely rightly, that people not just say he all the time, as if you read any essay, any literary essay certainly written before 1975, the unsaid person is he, And I remember at the time that it seemed odd that one would, this formulate he and she, or, various, or using there in an incorrect way, but that solved the problem, quite efficiently, even if grammatically erroneously. But, grammar changes, that's the way it is. But now it seems, I find it unthinkable if I read an essay where, the ungendered subject is referred to as he, it strikes me as deeply peculiar. And so, I mean, what will happen in 100 years with whatever housemaster may seem as archaic as lots of other words that we've changed to, and I don't mean epithets, I mean just titles of people. I don't think it's so terrible when we say, or most people say, the chair rather than the chairman, even though, again, it's technically incorrect, but so what?
But they changed it. I don't know if you were suggesting that maybe they changed it because it was a masculine term, but no, they changed it because of the slavery connotation.
Oh, I see.
And referring to, but there is no direct connection between the use of the word housemaster and slavery.
I think it shows you the problems with policing language like that, which is that we end up seeing problematic language everywhere. We end up seeing master as an affirmation of slavery when it was just, what are they going to do? Change the master's course now?
Right.
I think you've got a situation now where people are so obsessed with language and presentation that it's very difficult to say anything. And does that affect any serious change? No, it doesn't. I think it's quite a negative. I don't think it's just organically language changes, but that's not what's happening here.
Yeah, but sometimes you have to give it a little push.
Yeah, what's the definition of organic? I mean, it doesn't come down from a transcendental being, it comes from social actors. But your position essentially is that change is problematic, especially if it appears to be some kind of fragmentation from a center. And the problem with that viewpoint is that social change requires some kind of, bumping up against things, some sort of fragmentation. So in a way, while I could virtually agree with an aspect of everything you say, there's this big problem, which is that you take a specific example and then you generalize it to the totality. And I think that's where I get off, and that you perceive the world as somehow like all of these, the instance of the master, that's an example of language gone. Well, we don't really live in a world where language is so problematic that we don't understand it, right? So my basic point being, okay, you've got this instance, but can you legitimately move in such a macro way in order to sort of say, okay, this is a generalized phenomenon as opposed to this is an instance of something. I mean, as a sociologist, let's quantify it. Yes. Let's do empirical data rather than sort of move from the specific to the general with, just like that.
I think that's the fundamental tension between David and me, is whether these instances matter and are significant, or whether they're just kind of organic processes.
Right.
I mean, but your first point about change is that what change is being enacted today, and do the battles over culture enact change? I don't think they do. You see, I think in a way it's come out of an avoidance of material and social solutions to inequalities, that the cultural sphere becomes kind of the focus of so many activities. In a way, I care less about that actual kind of focusing on those cultural activities than the absence of discussion about social change. Okay, so that's one thing. But I do think we have got a situation where, sort of post-89, you've had a call for reparations from a number of different politicians. It's something that's really kind of escalated. So whether it's Tony Blair or the Queen or John Howard, you have the language of apology and making reparations for the past. I think that's probably a negative development. And I think what you have is leaders actually being legitimated like that, rather than the disenfranchised.
You say it's problematic, so what is problematic, in fact, as opposed to your conclusion that it's problematic? And also, I mean, you're, again, I would contend you're exaggerating the extent to which these leaders are doing all of these apologies and agreeing with reparation. I mean, we don't see that in the US. We haven't seen it very much in Australia. I mean, if it's happening in Britain, well, not that I'm in the culture, but I don't have a sense that there's this worldwide or even just European sort of mea culpas that are all over the place and changes in the air and the leaders are doing it.
I think it's there's a degree to which it's rhetorical. So to what extent has money been paid out to slave descendants? But it has to a degree. I think these things are incremental and do impact upon the culture. If you look in the area of museums, it may seem small, but thousands and thousands and thousands of human remains have been repatriated to Native American communities here, to Australian communities, to communities in Canada and New Zealand. Is that significant? I would say it is. I'd say it's significant for a number of reasons. One, because that material is incredibly important research material. So it's not just even the Elgin marbles. Research on that material tells us about patterns of human evolution, who lived where, when, how they lived, did they have osteoporosis, what did they eat. And you've had large-scale institutions such as the Smithsonian repatriating tens of thousands of human remains to Native American communities here. Now, does that solve the problem of Native American communities?
Well, why should it? Why should that simple act solve it? Now, if you, and I'll stop after this. But, I mean, basically, if you demand that a specific act solve this sort of humongous thing, then of course it's going to fail. And so let's ask the question of it that is legitimate for the instance of the thing. And in that case, I think we would see it differently.
Well, I mean, the NAGPRA was passed to solve the problems of Native American communities and to make reparations for settler society. So NAGPRA was the legislation that said all these remains should be returned. So those are the claims that are being made for it. I think those claims have an impact upon the activism of social groups. So I think it changes the culture of the way things are discussed and fought for. And it came out, I think, of a change with Native American groups moving away from demands for material equality, for land rights, moving more towards cultural claims in the 70s and 80s. I think that's probably a backward step. And then you have on top of that the fact that we will learn less about those communities and their history because the bones are buried. We won't find out. I mean, that's history actually being sent underground. So I think it has a material impact, and it's a negative one.
Yeah, I don't understand. This is the one thing you say that I don't get at all. I mean, the scientific research involved is not very important. It really isn't. And if there is it's not for us to say what this community feels and what the consensus in this community is. And it does seem to me, I feel it's also about the names of sports teams here. I mean, imagine for the sake of argument, there was this team called the Florida State Jews, or the, whatever. You might not think it was so harmless, but as long as it's Seminoles, it's kind of okay.
Soccer team in,
well, okay, but you know what I'm saying.
In Poland with the Jew name.
Okay, but I'm talking about the American debate.
I know.
I don't think cultures necessarily. I don't see why some anthropological research will get lost as a result of this. That too isn't going to change very much. That level of, but more to the point that we live in the culture we live in, and there is there are things that are unsayable in every culture, and they change over time. And what seemed, when I was a kid, there were wooden Indians in front of tobacco shops. I don't think too many people would say that was all right. And it was all right then, but it's no longer okay. Or the black guy on the lawn with the jockey's outfit on. I mean, I think these things feel offensive to us, and in the end, we are people of our time. And I think we should have a very good reason why not to do things like this. You're absolutely right to say it doesn't, change everything, but whether it's a regression or just, since we're not doing very well changing, those economic structures, why not at least change the things we can change? Seems to me at least an equally defensible position.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers for coming tonight and thank all of you for coming and invite you to come upstairs and continue the conversation over a glass of wine. And I'm told there's much more than just wine and cheese. It's apparently basically a real meal. So please don't besiege the speakers. Just come upstairs and we'll talk to you up there.
Thanks so much for sending me this. More than 140 characters in time. So I'll see you.
Okay. So Sam's not with you? Sam's not with you?
No, Sandra's not actually been in this world for several years now. Yeah. But he's a fine memory.
I
You
know
know,
it.
we rewrite history about him.
Yeah, so
Gets better every
he's
year.
still with you.
The Ralph Bunche Institute is on the 5th floor.
Oh, I get it.
I wanted to go back to this point of yours.
Yeah.
Because particularly the South Africa thing.
Let's go upstairs.
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll never get it.
I went, yeah, I think he was.
Everybody's a bad guy.
History would not be made by villains, all of whom should be forgotten. I don't know what most of
One of the things I might also say is that, and David kind of pointed